Okay, so different lighting types. Let's have a look at the different lights. We've got a 3-point lighting setup here, which is very basic. We have this kind of key light here, which is kind of our main light. Although to be honest, it's not doing a lot at the moment. Then we have this fill light here, which is just like basically just filling out some of the areas that the key light's missing. And then we have this kind of rim light, which is just like kind of casting light from the back so that we have a little bit of separation between the backdrop. Between the backdrop and our object here. So I might just move that forward away from the background a bit. These three lights here are all the same type. Let's jump over into our lighting properties. They're all point lights. Point lights are okay. Point lights are interesting though because they emit light in all directions, which is pretty good. And you have a few different controls. I would leave these because these are the different elements of your environment that or your materials that the lighting is affecting, and you want them basically all the lights should be affecting all of the materials. This is really for like art direction, which you probably don't want to mess around with too much. But one thing you can play around with is the radius of the light. So if I get rid of these lights here, if I turn these lights off, if I make this radius really small, like 0, you'll see how sharp the shadows are. And that's because the light is coming from this one tiny, tiny spot. So we're casting light into the scene from this microscopically tiny light source. In reality, there's no such light source, maybe fiber optics that are that tiny, right? So you need to have a larger radius in order to break up the light and break up the shadows to make things look natural. This looks very unnatural, and then if you just restore this to the default, it's generally pretty good. Where are we? Somewhere there's a restore default here. Oh, no, that's... I thought it was 0.2. Anyway, doesn't matter too much, but yeah, just anything bigger than 0. And you can see how here, if we increase the power of the light, I think it defaulted to 1000. Like that's super, super bright. That's unnecessarily bright. It's almost too bright in that it's struggling to even render the shadows. We'd have to crank our viewport samples up heaps for it to actually render these. And that's pretty impractical. Like the whole point of Eevee is that it's really quick, so you want to use things at a very low sample count. But yeah, it's just struggling because that amount of light, 1000 watts worth of light, is not really necessary at all in a scene like that. Cool. Maybe we'll go 0.1 with that, so it's a little bit softer. Yeah. So that's our point light. Obviously, we can change the color here as well, which I would not recommend. You generally don't want to be changing the color of your light sources too much unless you're going for a very, very specific effect. And even then, like, you want to keep your lights either natural color, but that's generally from like orange to blue lighting, and very, very subtle quantities of orange and blue. But yeah, you want to generally keep your saturation at 0. Keep your light, relatively neutral, and then change your colors of your materials and things under neutral lighting. The one area where we wouldn't like kind of think about that is when we're adding HDRIs, which I'll do later on. But those will add realistic ambience in terms of color and light to your scene. That the point lights and coloring point lights and other kinds of lights may not really do effectively. Okay, so let's move on to sunlight. So the sunlight is obviously incredibly strong and incredibly harsh because it's a sun. This is what we might call like a directional light, and that it is that it's basically infinitely huge and coming from a specific direction, which is why you get this little yellow thing on here. Where you can kind of like configure where that light source is coming from. But it doesn't really matter where you place this light. If we jump out of here, it's always going to be, an infinitely far light source. because it's here to represent like what the sun is. So we can move it up and down and kind of do things that way so that we can have like really harsh sunlight. But here, like I think maybe we should turn bloom off for this. All right, you can see what bloom is doing to us. Yeah, here we can kind of get an idea of what that's doing. When you have things in the way to kind of break up this light source, then it can be pretty effective. But on its own, like as just a neutral light source for like an empty scene, it's not a great light source to use. Now we have this kind of this window, I guess, in our back wall that's going to be where our light's coming through. So you can kind of see why. You can also change the intensity of that sunlight too, so you can bring that strength way down, so that you're kind of able to mimic the like way sun might fall through a window, or be cast through a scene, and like how that sun might kind of affect a kind of model environment, I guess. It's a pretty handy light source to know how to use, but you have to use it kind of properly, I guess. So we'll grab our sunlight here, and this one will turn into a spotlight. Okay, so this one might need a little bit more configuration. So we'll bring that up here, point it towards our, here we go, point it towards our object in our scene here. See our power is very low. Let's turn this up to 100 watts, maybe a little bit higher than that, 500 watts. There we go. Maybe even higher, let's go 800. And we'll just move that, bring it down into our scene a bit more. So a spotlight is kind of like just a directional point light, right? It's casting light in a cone, and we have like a radius of our actual light source itself, but then we also have like the size and the fall off of our lighting cone, or of our lighting spot here. So the spotlight's pretty straightforward. You can use this little targeting, just click and drag on that, like in the sunlight. Click and drag on that, and you can use that to kind of cast light into the scene in a very like directional way. Spotlights can be really handy if you just point this straight down, as like down lighting, or like stage lighting, essentially, because that's, I guess, what it is. Like spotlighting's fairly common stage lighting. And then maybe we'll go like 250 or something for those. Jump into the camera view. So this can be quite a handy light source, especially if you're wanting to do kind of like moody stage lighting, or have like very specific areas of your scene illuminated. Cool. Okay, so that's our spotlighting. Then let's have a look at one last one, the area light. So the area light is kind of one of the more natural, I say natural, but like one of the more useful, I guess, types of lighting. And it's like a point light, but only coming from like a certain area, basically this rectangle here. And the settings for this allow you to change that shape from like a rectangle to a disc, or an ellipse. It allows you to like kind of like make these disc or ellipse larger or smaller in certain directions. So it's like it's kind of like a spotlight, but instead of the cone, you have like an area that the light is emitting from. So you can see it creates quite harsh shadows if you have it kind of like directly adjacent to like a wall or something like that. But it can be pretty useful, especially in when you're using the like rectangle, and you just make sure it's all transformed correctly with your rotations. There we go. So you can kind of use this as like a skylight, or like a panel light. And in certain situations, like you could use it to in the place of a sunlight, to represent like window light. Let's go negative 90, and then we can chuck this back on the X and down on the Y, down the Z. and then this is kind of your almost like a substitute for like a sunlight or a diffuse kind of window light. Yeah, cool. So that's yeah, those are your different lighting types. So getting the hang of like how they all behave and how they all kind of interact differently can be a really handy way of just kind of like, bringing some really interesting and cinematic qualities to a render scene. The final lighting type I want to talk about is a bit different. So what I'll do is I'll stop this video and then I'll talk about that in a separate video.